Okay, now I wanted to give an example of some of the calculations that we did for the spectrophotometry of the DNA in lab this week. So we'll do an example of DNA concentration and mass with the spectrophotometry. Okay, so if you remember, we resuspended our DNA pellet in 100 microliters of TE buffer. However, we don't know the concentration of the DNA that we isolated. So we want to know the concentration. So as we talked about in lab, the concentration of DNA extracted will be too high to accurately measure using the spectrophotometer. So we do a dilution, if you remember, into a cuvette. So we took 5 microliters of our stock concentration, and we put it into our cuvette. Remember, these are our cuvettes. There's a turbo image, but you see what I'm trying to do. And in here we had 495 microliters of TE buffer. So we did a dilution. So as you remember from the previous videos, the dilution factor is the total over the transferred. So in this case, our total was the 495 plus, don't forget, the transfer volume, which is the 5. So 500 divided by the transfer volume, which was the 5. So that gives us 500 divided by 5, which is 100. So as we talked about, if you're going from a concentrated to a diluted, you will divide by the dilution factor. And if you're going from the diluted to the concentrated, then you will multiply it by the dilution factor. So let's do an example. So for example, if we got a concentration in our dilutant, this one here, of say 2 nanograms per milliliter. To find out what our concentration is of our stock, we're going to multiply by that dilution factor. So we're going to multiply this by 100. And that's going to give us 200 nanograms per milliliter. So the concentration of our stock is 200 nanograms per milliliter. However, we want to know how much actual raw mass of DNA did we successfully extract from our E. coli. So even though the concentration is 200 nanograms per milliliter, we didn't have a whole milliliter within this. We only had 100 microliters. So if you remember, 100 microliters is the same as 100 microliters is the same as 1 milliliter. Or sorry, is 0.1 milliliters. So if we want to calculate the mass within this, if you remember the concentration, let me do this in a different color. Concentration equals mass over volume. What we know is the concentration. We have that. And we also know the volume. So we want to calculate the mass, so the actual raw mass of the DNA. So it's going to be concentration times volume. So that is concentration. And be careful with units here. So we're in 200 nanograms per milliliter. So we're going to do 200 multiplied by volume. And again, the concentration's in milliliters. So we're going to keep this in milliliters. So it's going to be multiplied by 0.1. And that will give us 20 nanograms of DNA. So what that tells us is our concentration in here is 200 nanograms per milliliter, but we only have 20 nanograms actually extracted. So our total DNA that we got from our pure E. coli was 20 nanograms.